Most evangelical Christians tend to think that any queer interpretation of the relationship between David and Jonathan is revisionist, and that the Bible could never record a homosexual relationship between two men openly, because the Bible, they say, clearly forbids homosexuality. On the other hand, we have to ask ourselves, since the Bible has been revised and edited throughout the centuries, what would the description of homosexual relationships look like? Would it be clear, or would there be textual and editorial evidence underneath the surface of the story? We also have to ask ourselves what the original readers would have understood in reading such a story. It is important to realize that the answers to these questions rely heavily, say conservative biblical scholars, on the prohibition of homosexuality found in Leviticus 18:22. But as we've already seen in a previous post, the prohibition in Leviticus 18:22 was not directed towards homosexuality in general, but was either based on a view of the inferiority of women, or was a prohibition against practices of temple prostitution. What if the relationship between David and Jonathan was as close as the Bible gets to what we understand as committed, loving homosexual relationships today? Whether or not the relationship between David and Jonathan was homoerotic is a matter of probability. It is impossible to say for sure if the two were involved sexually, but I believe the textual evidence points to the probability that they were sexually intimate. Let's take a look at each piece of evidence in the story. Number 1. 2 Samuel 1:26 reads, I grieve for you, Jonathan my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. We know from Scripture that David was married to women, which make this verse stick out even more than it would otherwise. Of course, what David says here could just be an exaggeration, or it could be praise of platonic love between two men. But the possibility that Jonathan's love for David was compared to the love of women and found to be more wonderful could also show that David and Jonathan were sexually intimate with one another. This would not be stretching the meaning of the verse out of context. It is not queer revisionism. It is a possible literal meaning of this verse. Number 2. 1 Samuel 20:30 reads, Then Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan, and he said to him, You son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame, and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? The most interesting part of this verse in relation to a possible sexually intimate relationship between David and Jonathan is the phrase, shame of your mother's nakedness. When the Bible used the Hebrew word for nakedness, many times it referred to sexual activity or a sexual situation. We also have to ask the question, why would it have been shameful for Jonathan to choose David as a friend? Was Saul's throne in danger of being taken by David? This is, after all, the way the story plays out. And could a throne be taken by the simple friend of a prince? Number 3. Saul's anger at Jonathan in the above passage begs the question as to the significance of the covenant made between David and Jonathan in 1 Samuel 20:16. If the covenant was a simple covenant of platonic friendship, it would not have threatened the usurpation of Saul's throne by David. On the other hand, if the covenant was akin to a marriage covenant, then there was a real danger in Saul's mind that the throne would be taken by David rather than Jonathan. Perhaps this explains Saul's anger at the relationship between David and Jonathan, as well as the use of the terms shameful and nakedness. In addition, we know that because of the covenant made between David and Jonathan, Jonathan's crippled son, Mephibosheth, takes a place among the royal table of David, rather than being eradicated as a danger to the throne. If the relationship between David and Jonathan was not one like marriage, it would have been unheard of for a king to allow a rival bloodline to remain alive, much less to have a presence in the royal courts. Number 4. While not definitively answering the question, another piece of evidence that David and Jonathan's relationship may have been homoerotic lies in the definition and usage of the Hebrew word that describes their love for one another, ahava. This Hebrew word is used throughout the Hebrew Testament to refer to romantic and sexual love between men and women, men and men, and humans and God. It is commonly used throughout the Song of Songs, a love poem between a man and a woman. The word does not necessarily mean that David and Jonathan were physically intimate, but it is another piece of positive evidence in the question of the probability of homoeroticism between David and Jonathan. Number 5. Perhaps one of the clearest passages of Jonathan's love for David is found in 1 Samuel 18, 1-18, which reads, After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day Saul kept David with him, and did not let him return home to his family. And Jonathan made a covenant with David, because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic, and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. For me, it's nearly impossible to read these verses without immediately recognizing something akin to love at first sight, or infatuation. The phrase to become one in spirit is significant for our question. It mirrors the Genesis image of Adam and Eve becoming one flesh. This attraction and subsequent covenant appears to be more than a marker of simple friendship. It appears to be a lifelong commitment akin to marriage, with Jonathan giving David all that is his. 1 Samuel 20:1-20 records a recommitment of the covenant made in chapter 18, and the language is reminiscent in places of the Song of Songs. I wish to reiterate that none of this evidence conclusively finds that David and Jonathan were romantically or sexually involved, but I think taken together, all of the evidence strongly points to a homoerotic relationship. If we were to find a story of homosexual love within the pages of the Bible, this is probably what it would look like. In the next post, I will address a queer interpretation of Jesus' healing of a centurion's boy servant. The stories are found in Matthew 8, 5-13, and Luke 7, 1-10, if you would like to read them before my post. Until then, peace be with you, and as always, feel free to email me with any questions or comments at gaychristianteens@gmail.com. God bless.